On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, escalating China-U.S. trade tensions. Is there still light at the end of the tunnel? And dozens of countries sign up for the Singapore Convention on Mediation. Could it work?
The Singapore Convention on Mediation is the missing third piece.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin with worsening trade tensions between China and the United States. Waters for trade consultations got murkier on Monday after the U.S. labeled China as a currency manipulator following the fall of yuan. Under the clouds of a currency war, some say global financial markets plunged and recovered, though. But the question remains, is the trade war getting out of hand? Before we get down to a discussion with our panelists from different parts of the world, take a look at this.
A new battleground in the trade war with ammunition over a weakening yuan.
Lead a huge loss on Wall Street today. The Dow.
After the worst day of the year for stocks.
There also now is a worry that there could be a global currency war on top of the trade.
Labeling China as a currency manipulator was the latest shot fired from Washington, which came days after Mr. Trump dropped the bombshell announcement of 10% tariffs on $300 billion worth of Chinese goods starting September 1. The Trump administration insists China will bear the brunt of trade tensions, but Americans won't be spared from the effects. Beyond tangible losses, the bigger damage could be America's reputation. On Tuesday, former U.S. Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers published an op-ed in the Washington Post criticizing the current Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, for damaging the department's credibility by acting according to his boss's political orders and risking a recession. Summers said China was not close to fitting the criteria of being a currency manipulator. Another round of trade negotiations still set for early September. Could Mr. Trump's apparent high-stakes gamble on the trade war pay off?
A tipping point in China-U.S. trade tensions. Let's loop in our panelists. In Washington, Jeffrey Schott, Senior Fellow working on the International Trade Policy and Economic Sanctions of the Peterson Institute of International Economics. In D.C., also we have Arthur Dong, a professor at Georgetown University. Last but not least, in Beijing, Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Mr. Schott, if you could hear me well, can you?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Mr. Schott, tell us whether the negotiation is at this moment, in the concern of many, getting out of hand for both sides.
Well, I don't think it's getting out of hand. I think it's in deep jeopardy, but not much different than where it was a month ago. I think there were efforts to try to get the talks back on track in Shanghai. Not much progress was made, and President Trump made an impulsive move to try to shake things up. But what he was basically saying was the prospects for success were quite limited, and even a temporary agreement was on shaky political grounds in both countries.
Professor Dong, if you look at it, next year, election year for U.S., obviously it would be very difficult for anything to be done, particularly a trade deal, particularly with China. Now, the only few months that we have left is with this year. Now you look at the trend of this negotiation. Is there any way that we can get anything done before the end of the year?
Well, certainly the latest salvo that was fired by President Trump underscores the dual dynamic that's going on here. If it were strictly an economic debate, I think there would be room for negotiation. But now we've layered on a political aspect or a political dimension to the entire trade discussion, which now pushes us into an election year. So the stakes are extremely high for President Trump in that he's risking potential sort of problems in the U.S. economy running up into an election year. And so with regard to this question as to whether or not this dispute will be settled in 2019. I would have been more optimistic earlier in this year, but certainly with this latest round of events, I'm becoming less and less optimistic and more indeed pessimistic.
I see. The other two gentlemen, Professor Liu, talk about the latest rounds. Of course, they were talking about the tariffs being added to 300B Chinese exports to the United States starting from September the 1st, and also labeling China unilaterally by the Treasury Department as a currency manipulator, even though it is not, as many economists around the world have pointed out very clearly. So, but Professor Liu, the question really is, China knows all of this. This is tactics for negotiation, but with these tactics being used continuously and more, do you think China looking at the trade negotiation and think, is this going to worth it?
Well, it has been there for over a year and a half, and China actually also went through their own way of managing this entire thing. So China was taken quite much aback by such a thrust after, he returned from his visit to China with a big order.
Yeah.
And then, the China thought, well, he was just bluffing, so therefore there's nothing to worry about. Let's do tit for tat. And then, when the big blow, is really escalating, China is getting more and more serious. But after, now 11th, or now 12th rounds of negotiation, we feel, well, how far can you really push us? We are already standing, at the back of the wall. So therefore, China actually becomes more calm and more resilient in that way.
All right.
Because, whatever I can do, I have been delivering. And I keep my fingers crossed. I open with all my goodwill.
Right.
But if you really push me, beyond the wall, and that doesn't really, make any sense anymore. So
we understand that from the earlier discussions that we've been having over the past year about trade wars on this show many times. I wouldn't name how many, but so Mr. Schott, many know that President Trump is in favor of zero-sum game. That's just his way, and he's been trying to persuade everybody the way he's trying to do it, zero-sum game, is not for zero-sum game's sake, but rather to use it as a means to push China for change in his eyes. But obviously, that has not been done and achieved, and therefore, do people still believe, quote-unquote, his tactics of zero-sum game, even in Washington at this point?
Well, his tactics and his objectives are both economic and political. And on the political side, one of his objectives is to impose tariffs on China. That's what he promised his constituents he would do. And the voters are expecting him to keep his voters are expecting him to keep his promises. And so for President Trump, from a domestic political point of view, this is not necessarily a negative.
Professor Dong, on the other hand, how much will China be willing to still talk to whether President Trump or some of the key members of the negotiation team? And when would that negotiation ever happen, given the latest event? After all, both sides need to have at least some time even to climb down from the climax of clashes between the two sides, if they ever wanted to. Professor.
That's a very good question, Tian. This latest sort of salvo that's been fired by the White House towards China, and certainly China's response on Monday towards the sort of, again, devaluation of their currency, certainly casts into question whether or not China is going to show up at the next round of negotiations in September. I mean, we saw yesterday Larry Kudlow, the chief economic advisor, backpedal a little bit by suggesting that the White House and the United States was still open to negotiation and that there might be some room for adjustment with regard to the 10% tariff increase scheduled for September 1st, signaling that there's a bit of insecurity with regard to the White House's thinking, and that they came to, in a sense, a shock almost in terms of China's aggressive response, and that China might possibly not show up in the next round of negotiations.
Mr. Schott, if Washington has done what it has already done, is there any achievement so far, if you could put your fingers on? Is it about diverting all the international businesses away from the Chinese market and therefore, weaken the Chinese economy and the Chinese images around the world? Or is it about, clapping the hands in front of the farmers and say, your product's going to be purchased by China anyway, wait for us, wait for our good news? So what has been achieved by Washington so far with this strategy, zero-sum game? Sometimes we really need to reflect back and think about that.
Well, you're thinking about it in terms of what the tariffs have done. But actually, what is happening is President Trump is creating much more uncertainty in trade and investment across the Asia-Pacific, and that is affecting new investment and the rethinking of supply chains, rethinking of inventory policies. Lot more redundant inventory investments to compensate for what is now a much more unpredictable policy environment. And also beginning to think about shifting supply chains or creating redundant supply chains to compensate for any unpredictable swings in policy. That's very wasteful, and over time, that's going to be very costly in terms of economic growth for the United States and for China and for many countries in the region.
Professor Dong, I want to go to you once again before I go to Professor Liu here in Beijing. That is, if you look at the recessions that the world had over the past 200 years, usually something happens when there is a wrong round of monetary policy that would have started the problem in one of the most developed economies, and then the fire spread around all over the world. What we are seeing now, of course, I'm not saying we're in any way at the very beginning of the recession, because no number is suggesting that way, but there is the danger of specific policies that could involve everybody into a recession or some kinds of economic big uncertainties.
Yes, Tian. The question that you're asking actually is the question that Wall Street was asking on Monday. One of the greatest fears as a result of what occurred on Monday, and as we all know, we saw close to a 900-point drop in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and then a rippling effect across global financial markets in terms of the potential repercussions of this ongoing trade war. What's feared is exactly what our commentator Jeffrey has spoken to, is that this could be the catalyzing moment that leads to deeper recession or potential for recession in the months and the years ahead. So this is being seriously considered by very, very well-informed economists and observers, that as this trade war deepens and as we see a complete escalation in terms of tit for tat between the United States and China, this also magnifies the potential for a global recession.
Professor Liu, as you put it earlier, in your eyes, China has already been forced into a corner, and therefore, what's the worst to come? There's nothing, I guess, from the Chinese perspective, as you see it. Now, what we know about the potential of the Chinese economy is not necessarily what this trade war is about, but rather how Chinese economy has been functioning internally, how it's dealing with the debt issue, how it's looking at the potential of the RMB, how it's looking at this restructuring of the economy. Would this give more momentum to reform voices, rather, here in China about do your things well and do it as well as you could, no matter what is happening from the other side of the negotiation table?
That's right. We always say that when you are really healthy enough, viruses can hardly visit you. So therefore, it's really a wake-up call, ironically, for China that, well, there are still dirty laundries, we have to admit. So, corruption issue, bureaucracy issue, so that Xi Jinping has and his team has been addressing it with very hard fist. And economically, yes, so how do we really tame the SOEs to do their own job instead of proliferating in all corners of the economy, and then also how to encourage private enterprises, because there has been cold current for quite some time, whether private enterprise should be encouraged anymore.
And the list goes on. I guess there are a lot of things that needs to be done.
And also the market access. We continue to open the door, and the fact that the recent announcement to expand the free trade zone in Shanghai, and with very specific measures, indicates that only by opening the market, join global competition, and revive the vitality of the Chinese private businesses, we can grow stronger.
Having said that, though, Mr. Schott, how big a danger is there for, quote-unquote, a currency war? As we remember, the last trade war U.S. had with Japan, there was also the currency war involved. Of course, a lot of people try to compare the two cases and say it's really different. But from your perspective, how far are we from the danger of a currency war?
Oh, I think what was said and done on currency policy this week was mostly political and rhetorical. I think we're far away from actually disruptive currency movements. The People's Bank of China has been very responsible in trying to conduct a policy that maintains some stability in the rate, given the very strong currents in the marketplace. And the Fed doesn't have any interest in disrupting matters, and neither does the U.S. Treasury, to be honest. So I think what the President's announcement did this week was just institute a process of consultation, which is going on anyway. So it was more theater than anything else.
More theater, but will that theater be extended elsewhere? As we know, being the role of, building anybody as a currency manipulator, you have to get the quote-unquote consent from the IMF and therefore so-called international support. So, Professor Dong, do you think Washington will have enough quote-unquote allies in this regard about the currency issue, whether from the Europeans or from others?
Well, it seems that the IMF has spoken on this and has not accused China or labeled China as being a currency manipulator. And thus, these sort of alliances or requirements take a lot of time, and the United States would have to marshal support from multilateral institutions in order to consistently, address this issue of currency manipulation. But clearly, yesterday, the United States has formally labeled China a currency manipulator.
And of course, China said it is rhetorical and it is also unilateral. Mr. Schott, given what you have all said, the three of you, clear analysis. Now, when the hope of reaching a deal within the year could be quite challenging between China and the United States, will trade discussion with China be used as a political tool now for anyone with big political ambition to achieve, quote-unquote, the ultimate goal, rather than a trade negotiation? Will it be just a drama for a good political title for next year? Do you think that will be a rising possibility?
Well, I think part of the problem of the trade negotiations as they've proceeded this year is that the President was getting attacked by both the Republicans and the Democrats. And people in China who think that U.S. policy is going to be dramatically different if there's a change in the White House after the election next year probably will be surprised. The Democrats, Elizabeth Warren, for example, came out with a trade manifesto that sounded a lot like Donald Trump. And so there's going to be continuing suspicion about the bilateral relationship. But there's also one other area that is prone for conflict that you haven't touched upon.
Which is?
And that went under the radar screen on Monday because of all the action in the markets, and that's U.S. sanctions against Iran and Venezuela. New sanctions were imposed against Venezuela, and one of the targets are Chinese oil companies that are lifting oil out of Venezuela. And that's also a problem with Iran. So there are other fronts on the trade war that are yet to be exposed.
Professor Liu, it's a very interesting situation. China is being, in a way, used by tactics from Washington. If China agrees with the next round of trade negotiations, it is very difficult to sit back to the table once being ashamed by the other side of unilateral actions which do not necessarily really match the concept. Secondly, if China does not sit back to the negotiation table, all the blames will be pushed to China as to China was the one that really destroys the next round or possibility of trade negotiations. And therefore, it's all China's fault, no matter what the other side has done so far. So, Professor Liu, from the Chinese perspective, what do you think about these two possibilities? After all, there's some chess game called the Go, right? That is originally coming from Asia. You need to think about the rooms for maneuvering before you act. Professor Liu, some wisdom from you.
I do not think it's really wise or even responsible enough to really stay away from the table unilaterally from the Chinese side, despite of the difficulties or challenges that are there presented. So yes, as you rightly said, if the China really is staying away, abstention can mean that all responsibility, all consequences can be politically thrown on China's shoulder, which is really not the case. So and on the other hand, continuous engagement will also mean that things are in control. Even if they may derail, but they will really be extremely jeopardizing the relationship that is really being built for decades. So I would really see that there's going to be something at least already harvested, something substantial that can be reached. But the issue is that the worry is that Donald Trump is trying to lay up his the chessboard in his own way, and in which that no other successor can really play his way. So he's really setting up a plot.
Right.
So that's something we are really suspicious of.
Once again, tactics is one thing, but the strategy and the end goal is another thing. Before we go, I do want to talk about the end goal, because at different times we really need to look at the end goal from different perspectives as things developed. Professor Dong, there were original debates about the nature of this trade negotiation. Is it really about trade? Or is it about a way that Washington thinks about containing China and use it as a tool to contain China as time drags on? Professor Dong, your thought now.
Well, to answer that question, all we have to do is reflect on history. The United States has been through these episodes before. It's actually a compliment to China that the United States is actually fearful of China's rise, because they're seeing China in one industry after another not only doing as well as the United States, but in certain instances surpassing the United States. We saw this in the 80s with Japan, as we saw many of the key industries that drove the United States, such as automotive, electronics, steel, and so forth, that we saw the Japanese becoming better than American companies, thus instilling fear in the United States. We see the same thing playing out in Japan and Korea today. Japan's sort of friction with Korea is because Japan fundamentally fears the rise of South Korea. They're seeing industry after industry in which Japan used to dominate, steel, automotive, electronics, consumer electronics, now being dominated by very, very effective and powerful South Korean firms, and thus reigniting these historical sort of conflicts that stretch way back to World War II. So for that reason, I think these are some of the fundamental fears that are underlying and driving this entire debate. It's the fear of a rising China.
I see. Even though you did not use the word contain China, but people could read some messages from your answer. Professor Dong, thank you. And Professor Liu, your point?
Well, reality is reality. In front of the reality that, okay, some other countries are really catching up, at least they are getting closer to your heels, and you have two choices: either knock, other people down, or you run faster. So therefore, simply by knocking others down for fear of being surpassed, this is really a very negative approach, and that can really eventually deter the progress of the entire world, both economically and also culturally.
And final thoughts, Mr. Shah?
Well, I think the concern about China's rise is most prominent among the national security advisors in the White House. And there's a containment philosophy. But throughout the United States, there's a need to do what Mr. Liu said: run faster, improve our productivity, improve our innovation, and continue to maintain our economic lead in the world economy. So in that respect, what's holding us back in the competition with China is our own policies. And unfortunately, Trump's trade policies vis-a-vis China is actually hurting the U.S. economy. And so I think when there's a recognition of that fact, then political forces in the United States will coalesce around the election and hopefully lead to a more constructive economic policy, which will also help moderate the U.S.-China economic relationship.
All right, I got a lot of takeaways today from the conversation, gentlemen, but one of the most important is run faster. Jeffrey Shah, Arthur Dong, Liu Baocheng, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our live program. Dozens of countries sign up for the Singapore Convention on Mediation. Could it work? Some answers right after this break from different parties. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The United States, China, and other UN member nations signed the United Nations Convention on International Settlement Agreements resulting from mediation in Singapore today. Officials from 70 countries attended the signing ceremony of the convention, which was named after Singapore for its efforts in drafting and negotiating the treaty. The convention was adopted by the UN General Assembly last December. It's the first convention named after Singapore in the UN framework, but most importantly, this is a multilateral framework, even today. Take a look.
A landmark event for dispute resolution as 46 United Nations members signed an international treaty on commercial mediation. To be known as the Singapore Convention on Mediation, it aims to boost international trade and give businesses greater certainty by helping parties resolve cross-border disputes through the process of mediation. This means that a neutral party can help the two sides reach an agreement in a less confrontational manner, instead of long-drawn and expensive legal battles. During his formal address, Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong called it a breakthrough which will benefit businesses, providing them with greater flexibility and efficiency.
The Singapore Convention on Mediation is the missing third piece in the international dispute resolution enforcement framework. Businesses will benefit from greater flexibility, efficiency, and lower costs, while states can enhance access to justice by facilitating the enforcement of mediated agreements.
The United Nations representative Stephen Mathias termed the treaty as innovative, adding that it will ensure the global acceptance of mediation as a dispute settlement mechanism.
Uncertainty surrounding the enforcement of settlement agreements had been identified as a main obstacle to the greater use of mediation. The Convention sets the standards for enforcing and invoking settlement agreements, the requirements for reliance on settlement agreements, and the grounds for refusing to grant relief.
Dispute resolution experts echoed Matias' sentiments, saying that the convention will promote the use of mediation, especially in Asian countries, where it has existed as a means of settlement method for centuries.
So will the convention work? In Singapore, we invited Professor Kishore Mahbubani, a distinguished fellow from the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. In our Beijing studio, we have James Ray, professor of politics at California State University, now visiting Beijing. And also in our Beijing studio, once again, Liu Baocheng from the University of Business and Economics here in China. Gentlemen, welcome to our discussion. Mr. Mahbubani, of course, Professor, I have to go to you about this. So will it really work despite of all the fanfare today of the signing ceremony?
Well, I think you should first begin by acknowledging that it is a miracle that at a time when, as your earlier program demonstrated, when the United States and China cannot seem to agree on anything at all, it's a miracle that the United States and China have come together to sign the Singapore Convention on Mediation. And it is the largest significance that you should also bear in mind. It's not just about the technical details that a new mediation convention is coming about. It's in today's environment, as you know, where you live in a world where everything seems to be fracturing, people are losing faith in multilateral institutions, and in this environment, a new multilateral convention is being born with the support of so many powerful countries, and that's what we should really welcome about the signing of this convention today. It gives us, in a sense, what I would call a significant ray of hope in what seems to be otherwise a very gloomy world.
Well, I would love to welcome this convention, no doubt about that. I'm sure a lot of people around the world also would love to do that. But is it more symbolic than real term, Mr. Ray?
Well, I think it's significant, though. It was 5 years in the making, which is a very quick process. But I think there's nothing being begun here by the Trump administration going forward. So I think it's the legacy of the Obama administration and a better time in relations. But small countries, big countries all support this as a way for commercial ventures to make business easier. And so I don't think anyone wants to insert a wrench like politics into that formula.
I see. But at this moment, Professor Liu, we know the WTO debates and the reform of WTO, and to what extent whether WTO still works, or to what extent the U.S. will still subscribe to WTO as well, for the settlement mechanism particularly. So will this convention be a new way of thinking, a new mechanism that people are looking for?
I think it's also a wake-up call for people to have an alternative in solving disputes. And after all, you know, the businesses are more and more interconnected, and disputes naturally arise. So WTO, the arbitration panel, yes, they impose the justice or relief on stuff, but mediation is far more flexible, and you have your own voluntary choice, and then, you know, you can also choose your mediator, and you can halfway, you can also make some changes, etc. But the issue is that even if, you know, the relief is really agreed upon, how to implement that. So this is there to, you know, countries who sign up on this, the convention will translate them into domestic law so that their own court can really effectively integrate them and also implement or enforce.
Professor Mahbubani, therefore I want to go to you about that. So this convention, 5 years in the making, now we get it done, good, but will that also be, once again, the very beginning of deadlock negotiations and debates? as implementation become the most important thing now?
You're absolutely right. Implementation becomes the most important thing now. But remember, this is about, the critical word here is mediation. And in some ways, it reflects what I would call Asian culture. Now, you know America very well. In America, if you have a problem, first thing you do, you go to the courts. You have litigation. Asians, by the way, and Asian companies also, don't like litigation, right? They would prefer if they can find ways and means of settling the issue through mediation without having to go through a very expensive process of litigation. And what the Singapore Mediation Convention therefore does is to open the doors or to a new approach to settling disputes in the commercial arena.
And Professor, I have to argue back about that point, because the reason why litigation becomes very important within international framework like the World Trade Organization is because mediation sometimes doesn't work. Okay? Parties involved just do not listen to mediators anymore, or they don't want to mediate because they think they have bigger benefits if they don't. So now here's the difficult part, isn't it? Even though you love that culture,
well,
but it's not necessarily
the parties that don't want to mediate will go to litigation.
Yeah, at least they are given a choice.
No, the parties that do not want to mediate will not go to the mediation center.
Okay. Professor Liu, your thoughts?
Yeah, at least, to solve disputes, there are several ways. There is the most brutal way is to engage in economic war or, in revenge and retaliation. And the other is go to litigation, but it's very expensive and it's time-consuming. And then you go for arbitration, and you have a freer choice. You keep the privacy. But mediation is even more flexible. But of course, it depends on the free choice of the parties that are engaged in the commerce. But at least they are given a choice for conciliation before they go for more expensive and the time-consuming ways of solving disputes.
There's nothing wrong about mediation.
Right.
Certainly, it's a great idea, but the question is whether it's going to solve the problem or not, particularly the international trade problem that we're facing right now, with WTO now having its difficulties moving ahead with the role it should play. Here is the thing that we should really talk about, Mr. Ray.
Well, it's member states at the WTO. It's multilateral, bilateral trade deals between countries, and this mediation convention will alleviate some of the pressure on private companies. The case of Huawei could facilitate into this kind of process if the U.S. was willing to do that. But I think
the answer probably is not, right? That's why we see what's happening right now.
Yes, I think something like Samsung, Google fighting over intellectual property, those are the kind of things that might end up in this kind of process. But countries' prerogatives, diplomatic priorities, foreign policy confrontations, I don't think will be assisted or facilitated into a positive agreement.
Once again, I don't want to discourage the fact that this is an achievement by 70 countries. It's wonderful. It should be congratulated. But Professor Mahbubani, are we going to, from now on, depend on these quote-unquote alternatives, which sometimes you go in, could have a result, but sometimes you go in, you could not have a result. And yet, the beauty of international mechanism like the World Trade Organization is once you go there, if going for arbitration, you are going to have a result anyway. So, Professor, what do you think about that? Are we going to depend on alternatives now, which will not necessarily going to give us some answer eventually? Go ahead, sir.
Well, I completely agree with you when you say that we should continue to strengthen and build up the WTO. I mean, that's certainly something that no one would dispute with you. But as you know, you cannot deny the reality of today's world, where the United States is trying, in a fairly determined fashion, to undermine the WTO and make it ineffective by vetoing the appointment of judges to the appellate courts. So that, when that window closes, it's very important that you open other windows. And that's why the Singapore Mediation Convention, as I said at the very beginning, in today's context, is a real miracle, because it is in a world where the United States is basically going against virtually all multilateral organizations and either trying to weaken them or undermine them. Here you have the United States signing on to a new convention. So we should welcome that, and frankly, if I was a policy maker in China, I would say this is clearly something that is powerful, that we need to support, and China should really become the #1 supporter of the Singapore Mediation Convention, especially in today's multilateral context.
Professor Liu, are we going to see alternative possibilities like this keep on popping up in the near future?
Yeah, definitely. Because now when WTO does not really function as efficient as it was really designed, and of course, the mediation and also on a regional collaboration basis can really take the lead. And the other issue, I think, when China is now heavily pushing over the Belt and Road program, I think this convention can really serve a great deal benefit for China, and also the countries involving in the Belt and Road countries, when we can solve the problem in a conciliation way, and utilizing also the Asian culture tradition. I think that's a quite much approach.
Mr. Ray, final thoughts?
Well, I think mediation is certainly the future. Member states, nation states have conflicts over diplomacy, all sorts of issues. I think climate change, maritime disputes, economic issues are better served in informal dialogue.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid you've been putting on so much hope on one convention for mediation, but probably that's the only thing we have so far that's coming up new. Yes. Thank you so much, Kishore Mahbubani, James Ray, and Liu Baocheng. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. So follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in next time for more insights across China and the world. Good night. Thank you. James, good to see you again.